Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to the New Britain Museum of American Art. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you so much for your support of the NBMAA. I'd also like to thank exhibition sponsors and funders of Strict Beauty, including the David T. Langbrock Foundation, the Aeroflex Foundation, the Christine E. Mosier Foundation, Conry Asset Management, and Hartford Healthcare for making this exhibition possible. I hope that beyond this evening, you will join us for many upcoming programs that will include a curator conversation with a printmaker, gallery talks with David Areford, printmaking workshops, the local artist, and even fabulous music programs with composer Neely Bruce. Programs will run through January, so we hope we'll see you often. Tonight, we're so fortunate to welcome the exhibition curator, David Areford, for this evening's keynote lecture titled LeWitt Thinking Through Prints. David is a professor of art history at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and is also author of the exhibition catalog, Strict Beauty, LeWitt Prints, available in our museum store. David is also the editor of Locating LeWitt, as well as numerous books and essays on 15th century European printmaking and devotional art. He's curated exhibitions at the Cummer Museum of Art in Jacksonville, Florida, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and has worked really tirelessly with our curatorial team here at the NBMAA for nearly 6 years, with Lisa Williams and others on our staff. We're so fortunate to have David here with us this evening. Please help me welcome David Areford.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude to the many people who made this exhibition possible. First and foremost, thank you to Carol LeWitt and to Sophia LeWitt, along with Janet Passell and John Levertu of the LeWitt Collection, Pamela Franks and Lisa Dorn, Williams College Museum of Art, the second venue for the exhibition, opening in February. Here at the New Britain Museum, my thanks to former director Min Young Kim and the interim director Donna Casella. Also, my appreciation to curator Lisa Hayes Williams, along with Lisa Lappy, Sarah Georgis, Laura Van Dyne, Maura O'Shea, Amanda Schumann, and Jeff Mainville. And an extra special shout out to the fabulous collections team, Keith Gervais, Gabriella George, and Mike Mindera. And finally, I really want to thank the entire museum staff, along with board members, docents, and various patrons that I've interacted with during the opening days of the exhibition. You've made me feel right at home, and our conversations and the questions you've asked have helped shape my talk this evening. So thank you very much. Since many of you have expressed curiosity about LeWitt the man, let's start with a photograph of the young LeWitt. At first glance, this snapshot seems unremarkable, yet it represents a rare self-portrait by an artist who would become well known for skipping his exhibition openings and refusing to be photographed. Decisions he felt were perfectly aligned with his artistic goals. As he once told an interviewer, "I don't like my picture to be used because it has nothing to do with my art." This future reticence is perhaps indicated by the very deliberate off-center cropping of his body and the obscuring of his face. But notice the doorway on the left framing his head and torso, and the portal-like mirror on the right, hints of entrances and exits of liminal possibilities. Dating to late December 1952 or early January 1953, this photo captures the 24-year-old artist at a crucial moment in his life. He's standing in an apartment at 51 Cedar Street in New Britain, just blocks from this museum, where he and his mother had moved from Hartford after his father's death in 1934. He has just returned from his service in the Army during the Korean War. Only 4 years earlier, he had graduated from Syracuse University, and the trajectory of his artistic life was set in motion when he received a major cash award from the Tiffany Foundation. Being drafted in the Army had interrupted his plans, but within a week or so, he would start his new life in New York City. Here are two more photographs of LeWitt, looking a bit more comfortable in front of the camera. The one on the left appeared in the New York Times in 1961 for a story about struggling artists. LeWitt later described his first decade in New York as difficult, with many false roads and bad beginnings. And the one on the right was likely taken in the 1970s in his Hester Street studio and apartment, a few years after he had found his footing in the art world. His first solo gallery exhibition of sculptures was in 1965. He made his first wall drawing in 1968, and soon was also regularly producing photographic works, mass-produced books, various works on paper, including drawings, washes, and prints. Like other artists of his generation, LeWitt's goal was to rid art of the baggage of history, even going so far as to invent new terminology, structure for sculpture, wall drawing for mural. He formally articulated his approach in two manifestos. In Paragraphs in Conceptual Art in 1967, he championed an art in which, quoting LeWitt, the idea or concept is the most important aspect, and all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand, so that the execution is a perfunctory affair. In short, the idea becomes a machine that makes the art. Because he relied on a preset plan, he could avoid subjectivity, as he wrote. The fewer decisions made, the better. This eliminates the arbitrary, the capricious, and the subjective as much as possible. His aim was to show a thought process, and this is how many viewers perceived his work at the time. In 1975, art critic Donald Cuspit described LeWitt's artworks as epitomizing the look of thought, requiring an intellectual response rather than physical apprehension. One does not so much see them as think about them. But from the beginning, LeWitt acknowledged his work's inherently paradoxical nature. In Sentences on Conceptual Art in 1969, he declared, "Conceptual artists are mystics rather than rationalists. They leap to conclusions that logic cannot reach." Between the rational and the irrational, the mind and the body, is the viewer's perceptual experience, a complicating factor beyond the artist's control, as LeWitt acknowledges in his manifesto, writing, "Once given physical reality, the work is open to the perception of all," by which he means not only the objective understanding of the idea, but also the sensory and specifically optical reception that cannot be predicted, one of the many side effects that the artist can imagine before setting the idea in motion. Thus, with this notion of LeWitt's printmaking as a kind of thought process with sometimes unpredictable results, I want to explore the exhibition, giving you a virtual tour of some of the highlights. I'm interested in how these works represent a way of thinking, thus my subtitle, Thinking Through Prints. In other words, how do the prints serve LeWitt's conceptual practice, expressing his ideas? In this regard, I'm particularly interested in the various ways in which he engaged the medium-specific aspects of printmaking, that is, the particular possibilities inherent to printmaking that were unavailable in other mediums. Ranging from small-scale etchings to impressive series that encompass entire walls, I think you'll find many intriguing and even surprising works throughout the exhibition. The show is organized thematically as well as chronologically, although there are overlaps and connections across time throughout the galleries. The exhibition begins with early prints made from 1947 to 1954, and then there are 4 sections that explore LeWitt's mature printmaking with prints dating from 1970 to 2005, starting with lines, arcs, circles, and grids, bands and colors, from geometric figures to complex forms, and concluding with wavy, curvy, loopy-doopy, and in all directions. So let's begin with early prints. In 1945, LeWitt arrived at Syracuse University to pursue a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. And initially, he found the curriculum overly traditional and restrictive. But during his junior year, he discovered his passion for printmaking, in particular lithography. As he later recalled, lithography permitted him more creative freedom than other mediums, with a range of graphic and experimental possibilities, as he said. When he returned to New Britain in 1949, he continued making lithographs at the nearby Hartford Art School. Much more than simply student works, LeWitt's early prints garnered him his first official artistic recognition. They were featured in national curated and juried group exhibitions, including his first museum show right here at the New Britain Museum of American Art. And most significantly, the lithographs were recognized with a large cash award from the Tiffany Foundation in 1949. Undoubtedly a boost to LeWitt's self-confidence, the prize allowed him to change course. He dropped out of an MFA program, embarked on a life-changing trip to Europe, and eventually began his artistic life in New York City. These early works have never been displayed in an exhibition and have barely registered in a scholarly context. Only recently, in 2015, Kirsten Swenson published one of the early lithographs in her study of the artistic relationship between LeWitt and his friend and fellow artist, Eva Hesse. The print titled Street Scene from 1949, and it's included in our exhibition. Just 2 years earlier, LeWitt's early prints became known to a broader popular audience through an episode of Antiques Roadshow. The episode featured 3 woodcuts that LeWitt gave as a wedding present in 1955 to an army buddy named Tony Bacon and his wife Donna, who is featured in the episode. One of these prints, Untitled Dove, is included in the exhibition. What's especially interesting about this televised revelation of LeWitt's early prints is that it is linked to his well-documented generosity as a human being and as an artist. Indeed, there is another set of woodcuts, also including the woodcut of the dove, that LeWitt gave to a college friend. And I've also documented 2 other college friends who received early lithographs from the artist. This is a photo of a stack of prints that LeWitt gifted to the painter and art critic Sidney Tillum, who had met LeWitt at Syracuse University. These were preserved by Tillum's widow, Diane Radke. And 2 of these are part of our exhibition. LeWitt's generosity, manifest in the gifting of his prints, merges with his motivations for pursuing printmaking throughout his career. He wanted his work to be available to a diverse audience, not just to gallery goers, wealthy collectors, and major art capitals. This desire to share his work explains his ultimate gift of prints, that is to the New Britain Museum of American Art. And throughout the exhibition, you'll see many prints that are marked with the letters NB for New Britain. I'll return to this notion of personal and artistic generosity at the end of my talk. The knowledge of LeWitt's early prints undoubtedly changes our understanding of his artistic development, specifically his engagement with drawing, inspired not only by Renaissance tradition, which is often cited, but also the specific expressive passions and nervous energies of early 20th century art, especially the social realism of artists such as Reginald Marsh. Furthermore, these prints clarify the roots of the artist's lifelong commitment to the print medium as inherently accessible and democratizing, the very qualities embraced by American artists of the 1930s and 40s. Impressions of these 2 prints on the screen, Harlequin and Joe, were featured in LeWitt's first museum exhibition here at the New Britain Museum. And here's the announcement card for that show. It's titled Young Talent. And it's a great perk of this exhibition that we are reuniting these works with their first space of exhibition. Over 70 years later, they have reemerged for only their second instance of display. One thing that emerges from a study of these early prints is LeWitt's love for drawing. The lithographic stone allowed him to explore a range of mark making, from controlled and dense lines made with a litho crayon, as seen in Harlequin and the Untitled Politician, to the fluid strokes produced with a brush, dipped in a liquid version of lithographic touche, as in Untitled Bartender. Besides these additive marks, almost all of these lithographs include subtractive drawing techniques as well, including scraping and scratching, as seen in Street Scene and even in The Bartender, where scratch lines highlight the bottle and the glass in the foreground. I think the origins of LeWitt's eventual love of diverse lines, bands, and brushstrokes is on clear display in these early efforts. Also, in the lithographs from 1950, which were made at the Hartford Art School after LeWitt returned from Syracuse, such as this print, Fight, we can find certain compositional concerns that will reappear in his prints from the late 1990s and beyond, specifically the play between figure, ground, and edge, the ways in which the bodies of the men echo the rectangular frame, one hunching over as if pressed from above, and the other man's left arm conforming to the corner's right angle. Lines, arcs, circles, and grids. So when LeWitt returned to printmaking in 1970, his artistic reputation was largely based on drawing lines or instructing others to draw lines for his wall drawings. Whether produced with a straight edge or freehand, LeWitt's lines follow a predetermined plan and thus are stripped of any traditional descriptive, autographic, gestural, or expressive qualities. This was ideal for the artist's disciplined and systematic artistic practice, in which the idea or concept is the most important aspect, and all the planning and decisions are made beforehand. Removed from the architectural context of his wall drawings and produced from very different materials at a relatively small scale, LeWitt's printed lines, straight, not straight, broken, arcing, circular, gridded, and black or colors, create distinctive perceptual experiences, while simultaneously referencing a diverse visual culture. These lines bring to mind the graphic, notational, and diagrammatic languages of mathematics, science, music, and cartography. They record or chart various connections, movements, and rhythms. Printmaking offered a flexible and a controlled way to present LeWitt's linear vocabularies, as exemplified by lines and color on colored points on a grid, a set of 9 30-inch square silk screens printed by Joe Watanabe in 1978. And Watanabe would go on to establish his own print workshop in Brooklyn and would produce over half of LeWitt's print projects. And he's featured in a photograph at the end of the exhibition with Saul LeWitt. This series is meant to be displayed in a 3x3 grid, as you see it here, so that it fills the wall and dominates the viewer's visual field, presenting the primary colors as both ground and line, which with each color assigned a line with a different origin point. Blue for lines from the corners, red for lines from the midpoints of the sides, and yellow for lines from the center. Each ground color was printed with lines of the other two colors singly and in combination. In addition to their background colors and lines, the prints consist of a grid in gray. LeWitt predetermined the basic logic of colors and lines, as well as the number of lines, 16 from the corners and sides, and 32 from the center. But he let Watanabe decide on the line lengths and their endpoints. The visual motif of radiating lines, especially from the center in all directions, and especially in yellow against blue, is inevitably suggestive of a star. Such an iconographic link is not so far-fetched when we consider the related print, lines from corners, sides, and the center to points on a grid, black. LeWitt nicknamed this etching in aquatint Star Wars after the 1977 George Lucas film. The connection to luminous celestial bodies also makes sense in relation to the artist's interest in the artistic heritage of Italy, where he traveled and exhibited regularly throughout the 1970s, even buying a house in Spoleto in 1972. LeWitt often mentioned his admiration for the frescoes of Giotto, as well as those of Filippo Lippi and Piero del Francesco. In the work of these 14th and 15th century painters, lines are often featured as literalized rays of divine light, linking heaven and earth. A typical example is found in Lippi's Annunciation, located behind the altar on the lower apse wall of Spoleto's cathedral. In the scene's upper left, a cluster of gold accented lines originate in God the Father's right hand, making their way through a window and ultimately focusing their power to just one ray that ends on the Virgin Mary's shoulder. Of course, these lines mark the path of the Holy Spirit and represent the exact moment when the Son of God is conceived. These rigidly straight diagonal lines connect two distinct realms of being as sacred energy travels from point to point, from one body to another. Thus, the abstract, unexplainable nature of miracles is clarified through the diagrammatic language of lines. Lines from corners, sides, and the center to points on a grid black was created at Crown Point Press soon after a related wall drawing had been installed in Detroit. And this is wall drawing number 289. And it's instructive to consider the print in relation to the wall drawing, which is now part of the collection of the Whitney Museum in New York. Standing and moving in front of the wall drawing, which can be installed on any wall of any size or shape, the experience is distinctly architectural in nature, about the wall's scale and expanse, its corners, sides, and center. It is a perceptual experience in which one's body is spatially implicated. Although based on the same idea as the wall drawing, the print is a unique variation with a different number of lines radiating from the corners, sides, and center. The overall viewing experience is entirely different from that of the wall drawing. LeWitt discussed similar works, both the wall drawings and the prints, in terms of geography, highlighting the movement of the lines to, toward, and through, suggestive of a journey. In the form of wall drawings, the journey is mainly an architectural one, determined by the spatial and structural parameters of the wall, thus making one acutely aware of its top, bottom, sides, corner, and center, as well as its height and its width. But when joined to a sheet of paper and framed, these much more intimately scaled prints evoke completely different associations, specifically bringing to mind the medieval and Renaissance parchment and printed maps called portolan charts. A 14th century example now in the Library of Congress superimposes interconnecting rum lines radiating from points on a grid over the Mediterranean Sea and its coastlines, each carefully labeled with city names, the most important in red. Used for navigation, portolan charts were early attempts to visualize and measure geographic distances in an accurate way. The scale bar on the lower right allows the practical translation of the map into real space. LeWitt's map-like prints are without continents and place names, yet their lines still suggest direction, connection, and movement, and therefore time, as John Paletti has noted. Sent out in all directions across a grid, these lines travel to and from specific points, each of which is a kind of place marked with the excitement of departure and arrival. Instead of charting fixed and familiar territories and destinations, whether on Earth or in heaven, these prints prompt viewers to trace multiple trajectories, launching perceptual journeys of exploration and discovery through a strictly pictorial terrain. Bands and colors. So in the 1980s, the drawn lines that had dominated LeWitt's work in wall drawings and prints were largely replaced with bands. This shift began with a series of pen and ink drawings that were reproduced in the October 1981 issue of Art Forum. The magazine's cover image served as the basis for one of the artist's first woodcuts that you see on the screen, which was printed by Michael Burden in 1982. Translated into regularized bands, LeWitt's lines in four directions, he called it his artistic coat of arms, gains an appropriately heraldic appearance, as fully explored in several prints. This is one of the largest of his screen prints, made at Watanabe Studio in 1985, covering a paper sheet almost 8 feet wide. Compared to the 1982 woodcut, the bands, whether black or in colors, have increased in width and now alternate with gray bands, so that the graphic contrast between band and background is less pronounced. This is also the case with another woodcut, Lines in Four Directions, with alternating color and gray bands, which was made in 1993. In addition, LeWitt's normal progression of black, yellow, red, and blue is disrupted since the vertical lines are white, the white of the paper, instead of black, which complicates any clear system of figure and ground. These broad rectangular strips of black, gray, and color turn into completely impersonal graphic forms, far from the drawn straight lines that characterize the artist's early silkscreens and etchings. Although these lines also lacked an expressive character, they retained a modicum of indexical connection to an individual artistic hand, even one wielding a straight edge. LeWitt's bands take on more visual weight and presence. In place of delicate and dense marks that require close viewing, the bands permit viewers to take in the image quickly and from a distance. LeWitt's transition to bands was inspired in part by his interest in Renaissance wall painting and architecture, especially the facades of churches like Santa Maria Novella in Florence, with its use of marble bands, alternating light and dark, and creating square and rectangular divisions. In 1978, LeWitt remarked on the geometrical nature of this facade, calling it one of the most moving works of the Renaissance. With the artist moved to Italy in 1980, many examples of such banded and geometric architectural decoration were close at hand, as were many church pavements, such as those found in Spoleto, where LeWitt made his new home, pavements that were composed of colorful inlaid bands of marble. In the woodcut bands of lines in four directions, the usual visual clarity of bands is compromised. In fact, the woodcut's bands of lines are without any actual space, since the spaces are now bands. However, the uniform alternation of positive and negative space is replaced by a more subtle spatial dynamic, which is totally the product of color, as warm and cool hues, variations of primaries and secondaries, appear to advance or recede, rippling across each square division. As in related wall drawings, the print's muted colors are the result of transparent layers of yellow, red, blue, and gray, each indicated by LeWitt on a diagrammatic drawing labeled with different color combinations. This print was printed by Takuji Hamanaka, who prepared 12 separate blocks for 17 passes and employed the traditional method of Japanese relief printing, which involves the hand application of water-based inks with a brush and manually rubbing with a round pad instead of using a press. Although not immediately apparent, the woodcut conforms to a predetermined system, linking direction and color. A predominant foundation color is assigned to each direction: yellow for vertical, gray for horizontal, red for diagonal left to right, and blue for diagonal right to left. In contrast to the bold graphic legibility, the other printed versions of bands in four directions, this woodcut demands that viewers examine it up close, adjusting their eyes to experience fully the chromatic nuances at play. By the end of the 1990s, LeWitt introduced not straight, arcing, wavy, zigzag, and irregular bands in new, raucous, and vulgar colors, as he described them. The so-called broken band first appeared in 2003 and is the equivalent of his broken line introduced in 1972. But in place of gaps, there are segments of alternating colors, thus forming a continuous multicolored band. But the overall impression is of multiple streams of energy that skip and sputter in an irregular rhythm. This sensation of movement and rhythm finds its ultimate expression in the linocut whirls and twirls that you see on the screen. This is printed from 6 large blocks. It was printed at Watanabe Studio in 2005. And the linocut segmented bands pulsate as they curve and loop, whirl and twirl their way in and out of each other and across the paper sheet. The undulation is reinforced by the specifically diagonal divisions between the colors. This print's intricate design is based on wall drawing number 1126, Whirls and Twirls 1, completed the year before for the reading room of a library in Italy. Installed on the vaulted ceiling of the rectangular space, the work, painted in acrylic, is a site-specific response to the setting with its long tables, 2-tiered catwalks, and especially the spiral staircases at each end, which are explicitly echoed by the twisting, multicolored bands above. In situ, the wall drawing initially appears like a skylight made up of countless pieces of stained glass, or a large mosaic. But counter to a static form, the work suggests an amorphous cloud of colorful gases in perpetual motion, a modern take on the illusionistic heavenly motifs that are typical of Italian Baroque ceiling decoration. Now, although based on the design of the wall drawing, the printed version of Whirls and Twirls is more than a scaled-down copy. Due to the linocut's left-right reversal, it is a different composition, confined to a paper sheet and entirely removed from a particular architectural setting. In printed form, far from the monumental, Whirls and Twirls prompts comparisons to smaller, handcrafted objects and decoration, particularly certain works of the early Middle Ages. From the meticulous and colorful designs of Hiberno-Saxon illuminated manuscripts, like the Lindisfarne Gospels, to detailed enamel and metalwork, such as the famous gold buckle from Sutton Hoo, with its interlace and repeated circular shapes and curvaceous silhouette. The pages and surfaces of these objects are filled with linear embellishments, often in the form of serpents, twisted and knotted together. Whirls and Twirls is without any explicit zoomorphic reference, yet its interlocking color bands are distinctly organic and natural, communicating a familiar swirling sensation, whether of the earth or of the sky. From geometric figures to complex forms is the exhibition's largest section, with prints from every decade of the artist's career. LeWitt's geometry was inspired by the classicism of 14th and 15th century Italian painting and architecture, as well as 20th century artistic movements, such as Russian constructivism and suprematism. But a surprising revelation, perhaps, is the degree to which LeWitt's geometry was playful and inventive, not rigid or doctrinaire. His interests were far removed from any spiritual, metaphysical, or utopian aspirations, and his math is simple and straightforward, easy to understand. It wasn't about constructing a certain worldview, he said. In a 1969 interview, he debunked the misunderstanding of his work as deeply invested in complex mathematical ideas. I don't know anything about mathematics, he said, but it has to do with the way my mind works. It just is a way of making an order where everything is equal, nothing is superior or inferior. Beginning in the early 1970s, LeWitt created a series of works that visually and textually describe the location of various geometric shapes on the expanse of a wall, page, or a sheet of paper, usually featuring a diagrammatic image combined with a rather long and convoluted description. This is what we see in the location of 6 geometric figures, an etching that LeWitt made at Crown Point Press on July 8, 1975, as inscribed along its bottom edge. In this case, the text that describes the locations are integrated into the image, and thus the print initially appears to be a potential commentary on the codependency of word and image. But on closer inspection, the text ultimately hinders seeing, quite literally overflowing from 5 of the 6 shapes, obscuring their borders. Furthermore, an even closer look reveals that the difficult nature of LeWitt's words has been exaggerated even more by an intentional subversion that entirely blocks comprehension. The text has been reversed. I think you can see that in this detail, but you can see it better up close in the exhibition. When making the etching, LeWitt wrote in cursive directly on the copper plate. When printed, the words were reversed and thus rendered impossible to read. This left-right reversal is one of the key characteristics of etching, as well as lithography and relief printing, and it is utilized here to great effect. The motivation for LeWitt's use of mirror reversal of the text has not attracted much attention. In 1976, an art critic characterized it in purely negative terms as an act of deliberate error and closure, and a move toward illegibility. A decade later, the curator Jeremy Lewison expressed a more measured interpretation, recognizing the artist's gesture as an attempt to engage the viewer, requiring a mirror to decode the image, thus becoming an extension of the artist's love of games and detective stories. Even though viewers may be initially confused, Lewison suggests there is an element of fun in deciphering the clues. But there's much more to this than has been acknowledged in the past. Of course, on a fundamental level, in LeWitt's process-driven conceptual art, the use of reversal was a perfect way of making viewers aware of the procedural fundamentals of printmaking itself. In addition, when interpreted along with the print's overall geometric and diagrammatic content, the backward writing reveals itself to be a clever art historical reference, specifically to the work of Leonardo da Vinci, who combined his distinctive reverse or mirror writing with diagrams and geometric drawings, such as the well-known Vitruvian Man. Long enamored with Italian Renaissance painting, LeWitt produced this print during a period when he was thoroughly immersed in the art of Italy. In addition to its similar reversed handwriting, the location of 6 geometric figures is linked to Leonardo's practice of integrating word and image by graphically and conceptually entangling them. In both LeWitt's print and Leonardo's drawing, the two components tacitly acknowledge each other in the way that the lines of text are defined by or make way for the intervening geometric shapes, and vice versa. Ultimately, LeWitt's goal is to link contemporary debates over language and conceptual art to historical debates concerning the relative power of word and image. By permitting the reversal of his already difficult text, he renders it completely indecipherable, thus declaring the image's primacy over the text. Of course, the Vitruvian Man is the most famous example of the Renaissance desire to unify disparate geometric forms, the circle within the square, as well as to unify the human body with geometry. And the year after creating the location of 6 geometric figures, LeWitt returned to Crown Point Press, producing geometric figures within geometric figures, a series of 36 etchings using the same 6 shapes: circle, square, triangle, rectangle, parallelogram, and trapezoid. As in LeWitt's use of mirror writing, it is difficult to miss the connection to the Vitruvian Man. Unlike certain related wall drawings and structures, LeWitt's prints at a smaller scale and on paper supports bring us closer to the intimate context of Leonardo's drawing as a space of art and thought. Among the most surprising works in the exhibition, I think, are the stars. Although defined by lines, points, and angles like any other polygon, stars are unusual among geometric shapes in that they are thoroughly abstract in form and yet also invested with a range of iconographic and symbolic meanings. In the early 1980s, LeWitt was primarily interested in the formal purity of stars, adding them to his repertoire of geometric figures and employing them in a straightforward numerical progression. For example, stars with color bands, a set of 8 aquatints from 1993, presents a series of stars arranged so that they gain points from 3 to 10. In the middle of each star, the basic shape is defined by a single color and then reiterated by multicolored concentric bands. The varied palette is the result of layering different 2- and 3-part combinations of red, yellow, blue, and gray inks. And beyond the use of these foundational colors, there's no discernible system in the resulting hues. Indeed, with their randomly colored bands, the prints look a bit like the unassembled panels of a patchwork quilt. In contrast to the monumentality of LeWitt's wall-bound stars, his printed stars are clearly aligned with long-standing traditions in which stars serve as decorative and potent iconographic motifs. A variety of cultural and historical connections are unavoidable, dependent in part on the relatively small scale and the independent units of the print series, as well as their emphasis on separate bands and segments, defined with coloristic and linear diversity. A similar aesthetic characterizes the use of stars in various marble, mosaic, and tile designs, articulating walls and pavements, both in Europe and Asia. In Alberti's design for Santa Maria Novella in Florence, the horizontal entablature is marked by 15 stars in square frames. In the context of 15th century Italian architecture and humanism, Alberti's stars are holdovers from a pagan past harmonized with a Christian worldview, in which the Virgin Mary, the church's namesake, was hailed as Maris Stella, or Star of the Sea. LeWitt was also well aware of the tradition of stars as symbols in the Asian world. While in Rome installing wall drawings in June 1973, the artist wrote to his mother on an announcement card for an exhibition of 18th century Tantric paintings. In his letter, he references the card's reproduction of a six-pointed star inscribed within a circle, writing, "This kind of symbol is widely used in Asia. There are many variations, and they derive, I think, from the mandala, which is a symbol of opposites coming together as one: good, evil, male, female, love, hate. All of these related symbols are symmetrical, such as the star." In fact, stars have a special place in early Tibetan devotional paintings. The six-pointed star interpreted as the union of masculine and feminine energies, respectively represented by the upward pointing and downward pointing triangles. Beyond his focus on stars in print series, LeWitt also created 2 prints of single stars, including a linocut titled Schul Print, 6-pointed star, in which he purposefully asserts a symbolic meaning, both religious and personal. Indeed, for a man who was not particularly religious, the print represents a rare expression of his Jewish identity. With its 6-pointed star and the title's use of the Yiddish word for school, which stresses the synagogue as a place of study, there is no doubt that the print depicts the Star of David. In this case, the title specifically refers to the artist's local synagogue in Chester, Connecticut. In 2001, the congregation moved to a new building, which was designed by LeWitt in collaboration with the architect Stephen Lloyd. Partly inspired by the wooden synagogues of Eastern Europe, many of which were destroyed during World War II, the structure combines a historic sensitivity with a minimalist and geometric modern aesthetic, culminating in a square skylight framed by wooden beams forming a 6-pointed star. While this bold architectural feature informs the linocut's basic design, the print is based on the painting by LeWitt that decorates the synagogue's holy ark, essentially a form of wall drawing. But unlike a typical wall drawing, the panels of the ark slide open to reveal the Torah scrolls stored within. Thus, in the context of a new space of worship that resonates with the painful past, this exuberant, multicolored Star of David, both the wall painting and the print, is a celebratory reclamation of a symbol once used to stigmatize Jews in Nazi-controlled Europe. And finally, wavy, curvy, loopy-doopy in all directions. So during his final 15 years, LeWitt's prints became painterly in their mark-making, material qualities, and their optical effects. These surprisingly bold and sensuous works are composed of wavy, curvy, and loopy-doopy lines, bands, and brushstrokes that are often superimposed and in all directions. These prints are just unabashedly beautiful, even decorative, combining fluid and serpentine forms with luscious color. They seem totally unrestrained, and completely counter to LeWitt's normal mode of working. Yet these late prints continue LeWitt's regimented approach to art making, conforming to certain rules and limitations. In February 1997, LeWitt spent a productive week working at Crown Point Press in San Francisco. His visit documented in a photograph by the founder, Catherine Brown. LeWitt is captured in the first stages of creating a sugar lift aquatent, an intaglio process that involves a mixture of water, sugar, India ink, and soap that can be applied directly onto a plate. LeWitt is using a brush to paint gestural marks on the copper plate laid on the work table. When the design was completed, it was covered by a layer of asphaltum, dried, and then bathed in water. And this causes the sugar mixture to dissolve and to lift off of the plate while perfectly preserving the various marks. So after drying, rosin is applied and the plate is etched. The final print retains the distinctive look of brushstrokes and is characterized by tonally rich, diaphanous hues similar to watercolor. Among the works that LeWitt created during the 1997 visit was short brushstrokes color, an aquatent printed from one 30 by 30 inch copper plate that LeWitt covered with short curving brushstrokes. With each color, yellow, red, blue, and black, the plate was rotated a quarter turn, resulting in a layered image crowded with visual information. Thus, the same drawing has been superimposed on itself so that it spins around its center. The evidence of this rotation is obscured in part because of the overlapping brushstrokes, which are chopped into sections of green, orange, and purple. Yet extended viewing reveals identical marks along the sides and from one layer to another. There's an overall impression of symmetry, although this is dependent on an elusive, almost subliminal perception of repeated brushstrokes, intersections, and shapes. Thus, the image inspires more than an optical experience. It seems to visually enact a mental state defined by shifting levels of consciousness, from the image's surface layer to its nebulous depths. The simplest example of LeWitt's use of plate rotation is represented by brushstrokes in different colors in two directions in the last gallery of the exhibition. This is a series of 6 large sugar lift aquatents that were printed by Patricia Branstead at River House Editions. Although not immediately apparent, a typical LeWittian system is employed. Each aquatent was produced from the same 6 copper plates. 1 plate for the solid background in yellow, red, blue, gray, black, or white, and 5 additional plates for the brushstrokes, each printed in one of the 5 remaining colors, and then rotated a half turn, 180 degrees, and printed again in a different color and order. Thus, the 2 directions do not conform to LeWitt's usual combination of horizontal, vertical, or diagonal orientations, but represent identical vertical brushstrokes originating from opposite directions, from the top and the bottom. A dynamic contrast achieved not in the act of making the marks, but only in the act of turning the plate. Scaled to the human body, the long brushstrokes, almost 4 feet in length, record LeWitt's physical presence and the full sweep of his hand and arm. And the combination of the paper's velvety texture and the aquatent's transparent layers creates a sensuous cascade of over 20 different colors. Representing an expansion of LeWitt's vocabulary of mark making, I think the various brushstroke prints of the 1990s are a calculated flirtation with painting, in that they are a way of exploring the language of abstract expressionism, a style with which he had experimented but ultimately rejected in the 1950s. These prints include a range of gestural marks made with brushes of various widths, their separate bristles sometimes apparent in the uninhibited strokes of color. Of course, the printmaking medium guarantees a level of detachment, a separation between the act of creating the design and the simulation of brushstrokes and paint in the final print. The situation created is paradoxical, and I think LeWitt wanted us to be aware of it. These look like paintings, but are not paintings. Thus, they represent the idea of painting. And instead of fully embracing the pictorial vocabulary of abstract expressionism, with its recording of individual gesture and feeling, LeWitt has started with unique gestural and expressive marks, but then replicated them over and over in a fixed number of colors, layering and turning them on themselves so that their chromatic and formal interactions are random and unpredictable. Thus, each print is a visually captivating expression, but primarily the artist's conceptual scheme. Among the most decorative and seemingly least disciplined of LeWitt's formal languages is the one he named Loopy Doopy. This first appeared in wall drawings in 1998. Soon after, it was translated into several woodcuts, including Loopy Doopy Blue Red, printed by Hidemi Nomura at Watanabe Studio. The print is based on a drawing by LeWitt that was transferred to a wood block using transfer paper. Similar kinds of drawings made with two pens or pencils taped together were also the basis for the wall-sized works. Whether for a print or a wall drawing, the sketches bands were systematized through the perfecting and editing of any evidence of hand-generated marks, while still retaining a spontaneous calligraphic quality. The bright blue bands pulsate against a vibrant red background that presses in from all sides, as if the curving paths of the lines are determined by the limits of the framing rectangle. And notice the bands are given multiple origination points beyond the bottom edge, which reinforces the impression of organic growth, like a vine rooted beneath a trellis. LeWitt's investigation of brushstrokes and curving bands reached a peak during another visit to Crown Point Press in 1999. These prints feature, he made several sugarlift aquatints that feature loops and curves, a close variation of his loopy-doopy language introduced the year before. These aquatints are the most boldly sensuous of LeWitt's printmaking, characterized by an apparently unfettered visual exuberance, as exemplified by loops and curves red and yellow, and loops and curves blue-red. Both prints were made from two plates, one for the solid background and the other for the undulating and continuous bands. Counter to first impressions, the works depend on a high degree of control and planning. Using a brush to apply the sugarlift mixture, LeWitt aimed for uniformity in terms of the band's width, as well as their consistent all-over coverage and the balance of positive and negative spaces. Unlike the multiple independent strands of some loopy-doopy prints, here the bands are all clearly connected, which result in a much more emphatically two-dimensional appearance. According to the printmaker who worked with him, LeWitt invented the images on the spot, no working drawings, completing them in one go without hesitation or correction. Each print has a distinct personality. In loops and curves red, yellow, the yellow bands are generally botanical in character, complete with a small bud-like form near the right edge. While the red bands of loops and curves, blue-red, are angular, with defined corners, dividing up the image into a variety of jagged shapes. Both designs represent closed circuits with no clear beginning or end, pressing here and there against the sides of the brightly colored rectangles that contain them. This interaction between the bands and the border is reminiscent of some of LeWitt's earliest prints, such as Fight, which we saw earlier, where the positions and poses of the bodies appear to respond to the confines of the frame. Equally dynamic is the figure-ground relationship, the bands rendered in inks that shift in color against their backgrounds. Yellow becomes orange, and red a deep maroon. Particularly captivating is the way the negative space takes on a life of its own, the red shapes like flames and the blue shapes like blades, birds, or snakes. Now, for all their variety, each of these prints, with their wandering yet regularized bands, is loosely based on the grid, the foundation of so many of LeWitt's works. Indeed, several of the artist-related contemporaneous gouaches featuring similar loops and curves are titled Irregular Grid. The unseen lattice of the grid is always present beneath these seemingly unstructured. Its inspiration perhaps most obvious in the relatively thin and generally vertical and horizontal bands of the aquatint black loops and curves number 4. Unlike the other aquatins with loops and curves, as well as the loopy-doopy woodcuts, here the matrix of bands is denser and more difficult to read as a single entity emerging from below, entering from the wings, or proliferating within the confines of a rectangle. Instead, the many branches form distinct sections that stand alone within the overall thicket of bands, and thus defeat the utility of any plant or tree analogies. This is far from a simple vine. LeWitt has packed the pictorial space with so much visual variety that it is almost impossible not to see various figures, shapes, and objects emerging from the chaotic tangle. A stork's head in profile, a spider, a pumpkin, an ear, rivulets of water, wisps of smoke, and so on. As these seemingly hidden images appear, the print becomes less flat and increasingly three-dimensional, its bands simultaneously moving across the print surface and advancing toward and receding from the viewer. Taken as a whole, the loops and curves create a field of energy, expressive and mesmerizing. As with his systematic version of abstract painting, the product of replicated gestural marks and quarter and half turns, LeWitt's usual aim is to maintain control, to stick to a predetermined plan and a refined and consistently applied visual language. Yet in this case, he seems to have let down his guard as the fluid brushstrokes tip his art toward representation. And this brings me back to LeWitt's generosity. In this case, a pictorial generosity. The loops and curves prints are open, full of suggestions and opportunities for engagement, perfectly situated between the figurative and the abstract. They bring us full circle. Thank you so much. Yeah, I know the hour's late or getting late, but if you have some questions, I would be happy to entertain them. Comments? Sure. Thank you.